Today we move into part 2 of our course, and it's the section of the course where we cover sensation and perception, consciousness, learning, and memory. So we have 4 major chunks of content before test number 2, coming up on Thursday the 15th of October. We will spend this week doing sensation and perception. So today is sensation, Thursday is perception. Next week we do consciousness, 1 day, 1 chapter, next Tuesday online. And then we'll have 2 days each on learning and memory. And then again, test 2 rolling around in mid-October. Before we just launch into part 2 of the course, I do want to take a couple minutes to review a couple things from test number 1. So the results are listed here for you. We had a class average of just above a 71, so that's a C-. That's pretty typical for a test 1. I've had that class average be fairly significantly lower than that. I've had it be in the mid-60s. I haven't ever really had it higher than the mid-70s. Distribution is A's and B's were 33%, and D's and F's were 39%. So that's actually not a bad sort of pair of ends of the distribution for test 1. What I want to do with you guys is spend a couple minutes rolling through the items that caused the most problems. So I've got about a half dozen questions that were really the most difficult items from the first test, and a number of them are on topics that are going to be important as we move forward. So that's a good thing to make sure we don't just blow past something that you don't understand, because some of these topics will come up again. How about this one? The purpose of random assignment is to what? Use the chat box and just chime in with the correct answer there. Only about half of the class got this one right, by the way. Just use the chat box to respond. So I'm seeing people mixing up B and C. The correct answer is C, because random assignment is about making the 2 groups in your study similar in every way. What is B about? What ensures that the sample results will generalize to your population? Not random assignment. What is that? Random sampling. Yep. Okay. So that's an important concept to hold on to, the idea of random assignment. Number 10 here. If psychologists discover the people who live at the poverty level, oh my gosh, I'm going to stop right here. Where do you recognize this question from? Does that look familiar? And don't say it was on the test. Where was it? We did it during lecture. We did it during the online session where we talked about correlations. Okay? So what's the correct interpretation here? What's the correct answer? Lots of you guys chose D when we did this online, and that wasn't right. It was C, right? Because we had A being causal, and that's not right, and so then D can't be right, and the correct way to go here is C, right? People's economic status and the aggressiveness of their children are negatively correlated. We see higher levels of aggressiveness, thumbs up on my left hand, connected with lower levels of economic status, thumbs down on my right hand. That's a negative correlation. Correct answer was C. Shockingly to me, only half the class got that one right. I thought I was giving you a gift, but apparently it was not a gift that you liked very much. Next question here. Penny is a recovering drug addict. Her treatment emphasizes the influence of stimuli and reinforcers on her drug of choice. Okay, yeah, that's behavioral, right? That's about rewards and punishments. That's about consequences for her behavior. Okay, so the correct choice there was also C. Again, about half the class got that one right. We had the Michael J. Fox question. We had just done the neurotransmitter review on Tuesday. This one should have been better than half of you guys getting it right. What's the answer here? The connection for Parkinson's as well as for schizophrenia was dopamine. So C yet again. How about the next one? This is an interesting one. Dr. Feng devises a questionnaire that measures adults' extroversion, a stable personality trait. Computes the questionnaire scores of a large sample, does it again 6 months later, and comes up with what? Comes up with a retest correlation of 0.10. What's the problem here? What can you conclude? You conclude that it's not reliable, it's not yielding consistent results. If it was reliable, tell me what would go on with that correlation coefficient. It would be quite high. It would be approaching 1. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Questions on that one? Again, about half of you got that one right. Looks like I've got 2 more for you. This is a good example of a textbook question. So the textbook talked about the different goals of psychology, planning research, making observations, and then communicating those findings. That's all about describing. So the answer choice there was A, okay? But that's a nice example of something you should have read in Chapter 1. I didn't talk about it in an explicit way in class, but it's pretty straightforward, I think. And the last one here is on William James. This was actually the lowest percentage correct question of the entire test, which is kind of surprising to me because what was William James? What theory did we connect him in with in the first part of the course? He was functionalism, okay? So which one of these answer choices looks like it's a functionalism idea? It's the purpose of the behavior. It's definitely not A, because unconscious memories is Freud. Yeah, we want to go with C here. The way in which emotions aid your adaptation to your environment. What's the adaptive purpose, right? We even mentioned that when we talked about the ideas related to functionalism. All right? So, again, if you got any of those wrong, you were not alone. Those were the most difficult items. But I always like to take a couple of moments to review the items that seem to cause the most headaches for folks. Any questions about any of those items at all? Any feedback about the test? Too easy, too hard, just right, fair, unfair, about what you expected? I'm just curious what you guys thought before we just turn the page here. I'm shocked by the number of people who get done so quickly. If I could give you one piece of advice to the class as a whole, is to take your time. I mean, we have people who do 40 questions in less than 20 minutes, and if I'm doing the math right, that means you're doing a question every 30 seconds. There's no need to work that quickly. There's plenty of time for you to take your time and do what you need to do. Okay? Yes, need a question, you can use the chat box. There is no curve. There's no need for a curve because you have the equivalent of Test 5 via the all-night quiz for homework, and then you have another 100 points, so easy to get by coming to class and participating. So I've been doing this for 16 years. I haven't curved a test yet. I'm not a huge fan of curves because I don't want to be on an airplane that's piloted by somebody who was graded on a curve. Yeah. So was there another question or no? The hand popped up and the hand popped down. All right, let me blind you with the yellow slides here and let me paste into the chat box a list of learning outcomes that we're working on here in Chapter 3 on sensation and perception. If you look at that list that I just pasted into the chat box, I am going to be covering the first 8 of those, but I will give you the warning that numbers 7 and 8 on olfaction and taste are going to be your responsibility as you read Chapter 3. Okay, so we will cover the first 6 during our discussion this morning, and then you'll read about what's going on for number 7 and 8 on olfaction, which is smell, and then taste. So we're going to be talking about sensation and perception, and I want to begin by helping you to make a distinction between the two. Okay. Well, the first distinction in our course is going to be we're going to do sensation today, and then on Thursday when we get together in AL201, we're going to do perception. But what other distinctions can we make between these two things? Well, the way that I like to describe this is that sensation is earlier and more biological in its focus, whereas perception is later. If I just get my fingers in the right place on the keyboard, I'd be in good shape. And it's more psychological. I want to even fit the whole word on there. Okay? So what we're going to focus on today is still going to involve a fair amount of biological stuff. We're going to be talking about hardware. We're going to be talking about parts of the eye and parts of the ear and the parts of the brain that those visual and auditory processing structures transmit information to. We're going to talk about the visual cortex in your occipital lobe in the back of your head and the auditory cortex in the temporal lobes on the sides of your head. That's sensation. As we get into Thursday's discussion on perception, we're not going to be seeing hardware anymore. We're not going to be talking about action potentials or receptor cells or transduction or any other parts of the brain at that point. We're going to be talking about higher level sorts of processing. So let's distinguish these with what I've built in here on this first slide, where sensation is the process by which sensory organs in your eyes, in your ears, your nose, your mouth, your skin, and other tissues take in environmental stimulation and they detect stimuli. So again, I would say in my notes I want to have that sensation is earlier and more biological in its focus. Okay? That's what sensation is going to be about. It's database processing because it's us sort of crunching the numbers, if you will, as we are being bombarded by sound waves. Okay? So at this point, it was perfect timing. In the first class, one of those little golf cart trucks drove by my office here, and I heard that sound. Okay? And I said, when we're talking about the sound waves banging on the eardrum in my middle ear, we're talking about sensation. We're talking about earlier and biological processing. When we get down to perception, the phrase I always think of with perception is that of a mental image. And in my mind, I had a mental image, right? You know those little golf carts that drive around campus and they're picking up stuff in the trash bucket and the guys are working on the bushes and the trees and all that, right? I have that mental image of that vehicle and not an 18-wheeler and not a fire truck and not a motorcycle. Well, that kind of mental image is driven by perceptual processing, this knowledge-based processing, where I'm organizing, and I would say maybe the key word here is I'm interpreting those sensory stimuli. Okay? So the sound waves, yeah, are banging on my eardrums. That's sensation. When I'm ending up with this mental image in my mind of that little golf cart kind of truck, that is now at the level of perception. So again, when we're talking about perception, we're talking about processing that is later and more psychological in its focus. I knew I wouldn't fit that on the slide twice. Too many long words there. I'm trying to fit in more psychological. I can give you another example of perception. Okay, if you received a phone call this morning from your mom and then this afternoon from your sister, and you have a mental image, a picture of those two people that are separate and distinct from each other, that's about perception, right? Mom versus sister, right? Their voices might sound somewhat similar, okay, but there are enough differences that you can detect that. And when you're talking to your mom, you're sort of picturing her. As you're sitting there listening to me right now, you might have a mental image. You've seen me enough times now to know kind of what I look like, even if you sit in the back and I'm some little guy up front, right? You have some sense of that. That's perception, okay? If instead we're talking about the light waves from your computer screen being projected through your visual system, through your eyes, onto the retina on the back of your eye, that's sensation, okay? Does everybody see that distinction between sensation and perception? I'm going to spell it out that way and again tell you that our focus today is clearly going to be on sensation. We'll get to perception on Thursday. In fact, we'll probably have enough time today to set the stage for our discussion of perception at the end of today's online session. All right, well, the overarching title for what we're going to be doing here is called psychophysics. Psychophysics is the study of the relationships between physical characteristics of stimuli, the intensity of the light, let's say, in the room that you're in right now, and our psychological experience of them. So psychophysics is basically what sensation and perception is all about. So I'm just going to write S&P up here. Psychophysics or sensation and perception would be interchangeable terms. I actually want to begin by seeing what you know about psychophysics sensation and perception with a quick little polling question here. So let me push a couple buttons on my end to make this be what I want it to be for you guys. So an A, B, C, D question now. Up above the list of names, you can choose your answer choice by rolling over the letter A. The question is this. You find that you have to add 1 teaspoon of sugar to a cup of coffee that already has 5 teaspoons of sugar in it to notice the difference in sweetness. If you have a cup of coffee with 10 teaspoons of sugar in it, how many teaspoons would you have to add to notice the difference in sweetness at least half the time? I'll give you guys a minute or so to think through that one. All right, 10 more seconds, guys. Here we go. All right, so most of you think that it's 2 teaspoons of sugar to notice that change in sweetness. Choice number 2 is A, where you said it was 1 teaspoon, and a couple people thought it was C or D. This is one of these pre-teaching, post-teaching questions, so let's see what it looks like when we come back to this in just a bit. As of right now, 64 of you guys out of, what is that, 76, 89 of you thought it was choice B. That was the most popular choice. So let's talk about psychophysics, and I want to introduce 2 terms that I guarantee I'm going to ask you some test questions about. So it would be a good time to perk up and pay attention at this point. First of those 2 terms is an absolute threshold. It says here, an absolute threshold is the minimum stimulation needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. The 50% of the time is just to make sure that you are reliably and consistently able to notice that something is present. So an absolute threshold is the minimum stimulation that's required for you to notice that something is there. Like, what is the minimum amount of volume that I have to crank out of these speakers for you to be able to hear the song? Okay? That's what an absolute threshold is. It's the first amount of something as we go from none of that to some amount of that, where you would maybe raise your hand and say, I heard something, I saw something, I smelled something. Okay? To give you a couple different examples. So what does that remind you of that we just finished talking about in the section on the action potential? Should remind you of something that we did at the very end of our discussion of Chapter 2 Bio. The threshold, and we related that to what concept, what law? For the action potential. Yeah, the all or none law, right? So this absolute threshold is when we first notice that something has happened with our visual system, with our auditory system, with our olfactory system. So I'll give you a basic example, right? The absolute threshold would be something like this. If you were in a completely darkened room, and I had one of those dimmer switches on the wall to make the light get brighter and brighter and brighter, okay? And I said, raise your hand or say, I see it, when you first notice that the room has gotten brighter, okay? Well, if we're starting at 0, and the first time that you notice that the room is brighter than complete darkness, like, I see it, that would be your absolute threshold for vision. Let me give you some examples of absolute thresholds. Our absolute threshold for our sense of touch is a bee's wing falling on your cheek. I think the hearing one makes the most sense here. The ticking of an analog clock, obviously, at 20 feet. If you were in a soundproof room and it had a ticking clock on the wall over there, you'd be able to notice that sound. That's your absolute threshold for hearing. For smell, it's perfume. In a 6-room apartment, 1 drop of perfume. Vision, on a clear night, a candle 30 miles away. The taste one makes a lot of sense to me. 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. So what we're saying is if you had less than a teaspoon of sugar, you would not be able to reliably detect that water is a little bit sweet tasting, okay? It's 1 teaspoon where you first are above that threshold, noticing that there has been a change in sweetness, okay? So those are some examples of this change from nothing to something, okay? No sound at all coming out of speakers. Oh, you just turned it on. I raise my hand and notice that it's above my threshold. The second big concept here is that of the just noticeable difference. It's one of my favorite terms in the whole course because the term basically defines itself, doesn't it? It's the minimum difference between two stimuli required for detection 50% of the time. So now we're talking about a difference, and it's a difference between two stimuli. How different do they need to be? It's a difference threshold. How much of a change is necessary for me to notice, let's say, that the music got louder or that the music got softer? Okay, it's a difference threshold. What's really cool about just noticeable differences is the amount of change that's required depends on your starting point. And this is known as Weber's Law. Weber's Law says that JNDs, these changes, something is brighter, something is darker, something is louder, the music is softer, right? Those changes are proportional to the size of the original stimulus. So how much of a change is necessary for you to notice it depends on where you started from. So let me give an example of music volume, right? You've got a nice speaker system at home, and let's say that your roommate notices a change in the volume when it goes from 20 up to 26. So the first question is, what percentage increase is that when we go from 20 to 26? I need the math majors to chime in. When we go from 20 to 26, we have an increase of what percent? Crickets chirping. No one wants to take a stab at it. 30%, thank you. Yes, how did you get 30%? What was the calculation? 6 over 20, very good. Okay, so let's just say, just for sake of presentation, that that is the JND, right? That's the just noticeable difference for your speaker system when it goes from 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. People don't notice it as louder until it gets to 26. I'm just making this up. It's not really 30%, but I'm just giving it as an example. What if instead you were having a rocking party at your place and it was already at 50? What would it need to be increased to for people to notice, hey, the music got louder, didn't it? We'd have to go from 50 to what to get to that point? If J and D's are proportional to the original stimulus. Okay, I see a lot of people saying 65. How'd you come up with 65? That's correct, by the way. Why is it 65? Because 30% of 50 gets you a 15-unit increase, so 50 plus 15 gets you up to 65. Yes, you will need to be able to do these simple kinds of math calculations on test number 2. Yeah, or 50 times 1.3, even better. Okay, so we go from 50 to 65. Okay, so it depends where you start, right? J and D's are proportional to where you're starting. I'll give you another example. Let's say we want to talk about, it's really not touch, but it gives us some math to work with. Let's say you notice when you're holding a pile of books that weigh 10 pounds and you have a blindfold on, and somebody puts more stuff, more books on top, you notice that the pile of books got heavier when it goes from 10 to 12 pounds. What's the increase there? When we go from 10 pounds to 12 pounds. We got a 20% increase. We're going to go to Oliver for all math questions from this point forward. Okay, so if it's a 20% increase, what if instead of 10 pounds of books, let's say you were holding 100 pounds of books? For you to notice that the 100 pounds of books got heavier, it would have to go from 100 to 120. We're off and running. So J and D's are proportional to where you started. Okay, does that make sense? Let me stop there for a second. Questions about J and D's, just noticeable differences. So here's the idea, guys, right? Absolute thresholds are when we go from nothing to something. J and D's are when we go from something to either less of that something or more of that something, right? We could talk about J&Ds for perceiving the brightness of the lights in the room by having a dimmer switch, and maybe with numbers around it, right? I want you to raise your hand and tell me when it got brighter or darker in here, okay? That's where we would be talking about J&Ds, because the light is there, and now there's less of it, or there's more of it. Okay, that's what J&Ds are about. Changes between two stimuli. What is an absolute threshold about? It's a change from what? Or a J&D from what? You can actually tie these two together and say absolute thresholds are really what? J&Ds from what? You got it, Tyler. They're J&Ds from zero, right? From nothing to something. So if you wanted to tie these concepts together, you could say an absolute threshold is really about a just noticeable difference from zero to something, whereas a J&D is about a change from something to either more or less of that something. Okay, I feel like I've beaten that into the ground adequately. Questions, confusion about any of those concepts there? That's a couple of test questions right there. Something about absolute thresholds, something about J&Ds and Weber's law. Yasmin, yes. And I'm going to give you that question about the coffee and the sugar again in about 1 more minute here. And I just made up these, you know, an increase of 30% or an increase of 20% or an increase of 10%. If I give you one of these on the test, I'm going to give you a simple percentage to calculate. I'm not going to say like a 9.5% increase. I'm going to do something pretty straightforward. Okay? All right, let's go back to that question about the coffee and the sugar, and you guys can answer that by rolling over the letter A up top again. So what do you think it is now? All right, let's take a look at the results of this, see if we're better than we were before. All right, we've got 65 out of 76 of you. If I do the percentage there, 65 out of 76. We're at 86%. We're at about 70% on the first effort. Yeah. Why is it 2? Why is it B? 2 teaspoons of sugar when there are 10 in it already. It's proportional. What is the percentage increase here? It's a 20% increase. Yep. All right. What am I testing here? What concept is this question about? J&Ds and what? What concept related to that is Weber's law? Absolutely. So I'm not going to ask you a question that, that says, which of these is the correct definition of Weber's law. I'm going to make you apply it. You know how I work, right? Examples and applications. So I'm going to give you a scenario like that, and that's what you're going to need to be able to work your way through. All right? Any questions on that before we roll on? All right, here's the deal, guys. We have about 45 minutes, and we could spend 45 minutes going through each and every human sensory system and talk about how it works and talk about the hardware involved. And by the end of it, you would want to probably stick a fork in your eye. So here's what I do. Instead of going through all of these one at a time, I choose to go through the top 2 together with you in class. Okay, so we'll go through vision and we'll go through hearing. And here's what I do for you. I offload onto you the review of smell and taste and the somatosenses, which includes touch. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Okay, so we'll spend our time above the line here. We'll talk about vision and hearing. We'll review the hardware, major parts of the eye, major parts of the ear. We'll talk about receptor cells and transduction. And then your job is to read about how those similar kinds of ideas map onto smell and taste and the somatosenses. So let me add a couple of little things about these guys before we focus in on vision and hearing. I want to note on the top end here, as we get into this discussion of the sensory systems, that smell and taste are referred to as the chemical senses. Okay, so you want to get that in your notes. Smell and taste are referred to as the chemical senses. Why are they referred to as the chemical senses? Because they have receptor cells that are sensitive to chemical molecules rather than being sensitive to some form of energy. So we're going to talk about vision and talk about the electromagnetic spectrum. Our visual system is responsive to electromagnetic radiation. It's a form of energy. Our auditory system is responsive to sound energy, sound waves. Okay? Well, it's very different for smell and taste because they respond to chemicals rather than to forms of energy. Okay? Collectively, touch is subsumed along with the vestibular sense and kinesthesis under this title of the somatosenses. So you're looking for a fifth sense here of touch. We pull it in under the somatosenses. The somato part means what? Tell me in the chat box. When you have the somato, what does that mean? I need a bio major who knows something about this. You've never seen somato or somatic before? Has to do with your body. Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, so these body senses include your sense of touch, which you'll read more about in the textbook. It includes your vestibular sense. What is your vestibular sense about? What does that give you information about? Anyone? Equilibrium, yes. Thank you, Miranda. That's really good. So it's about balance, right? It's about your body's position and orientation in space. Kinesthesis provides information about the positions and movements of muscles and joints, which we, honestly, as psychologists, don't care a whole heck of a lot about, okay? So again, we'll focus on vision and hearing. You'll read about smell and taste and touch down below here in the textbook. And I'm going to give you a couple of unifying concepts that as you read about those other senses, you should be looking for information about those unifying concepts. And the major unifying concept for these senses is that of the idea of receptor cells. So let's talk about receptor cells. Receptor cells are cells that are specific to each sense that stimulate neurons in your central nervous system. Okay? So basically, when you're reading about the other senses outside of vision and hearing, which I'll tell you about, you should be looking to identify, like, what are the receptor cells for taste, let's say. Where are they located? Because these receptor cells are ultimately going to stimulate neurons in the CNS. Who remembers what CNS stands for? What is that about? Your central nervous system. So here's the idea, guys. This is why this is a huge concept. These receptor cells take the light waves for vision and the sound waves for hearing, and they transduce those sights and sounds and smells. That is, they convert it, okay? There are other synonyms we could put here. They convert or they translate those sights and sounds and smells into what? What is the language of the central nervous system? What did we talk about last week in neurocommunication for 45 minutes or longer? All about the what? It was 2 words. Electrical impulses, also known as what? We need to convert sights and sounds and smells from the world into action potentials. Yes, Jeffrey, thank you for that, right? So if we can take these sights and sounds and smells and turn them into action potentials, then our brain cells, the neurons in our brain, can take that and run with that. And that's what transduction is about. That's what these receptor cells do. This is why this is a huge concept, right? Here's the deal, guys. If I opened up the back of your skull, which I'm not planning to do, and shined a flashlight onto your primary visual cortex in your occipital lobe at the back of your head, would you be able to tell me that I was shining a light on the back of your head? Would you, quote unquote, see anything if I shined a light on that part of your brain in the back of your head? Tell me. No, why not? Why not is because you don't have receptor cells in your brain. You have receptor cells in your visual system. We're going to call them rods and cones. If you want an example of these, right here, it doesn't mean anything to you yet, but it will shortly. We have these things called rods and cones for vision. And they transduce or convert or translate the incoming light waves from your environment into action potentials. Without receptor cells, you're not going to see anything. Okay, so it's sort of this magical transformation that goes on when these receptor cells transduce light waves and turn them into action potentials. I don't even understand how they do it. I'm not a biological psychologist. I just know that they do it. Okay, and I know that for our purposes, this concept of receptor cells and transduction, these twin concepts, are really, really important. Okay. Any questions about receptor cells or transduction, what that's about and why it's important? Okay, again, it's converting it, and why it's important is because we have a central nervous system that speaks the language of action potentials. It doesn't speak any other language. Okay, if I banged sound waves off of your temporal lobe auditory cortex, you're not going to be like, oh, I heard something. It needs to go through the system you've got built in, which includes these receptor cells for hearing, that transduce the sound waves into action potentials. So let's begin by talking about vision. Vision is a sense that we have that is tuned to a very thin band of the full electromagnetic spectrum. That's really the point of this slide, that visible light is only a thin band within the full electromagnetic spectrum. We have a visual system that is attuned to light waves between 400-ish and 700-ish nanometers, which is a billionth of a meter, okay, in terms of the wavelength, which is from the top of one wave to the top of the next wave. Okay, we are responsive to electromagnetic radiation between about 400 and about 700 nanometers in wavelength. Okay, said another way, you don't see X-rays, you don't see radar. You don't go down by the airport like, dude, look at the radar waves. You don't see it, right? You don't see radio waves, okay? We have this very thin band from dark purple on the left, around 400 nanometers, to bright red on the right, about 700 nanometers. Okay, so we would say that red is a color for us that has a longer wavelength in terms of the electromagnetic waves that are bombarding our visual system. Okay, and the visual system really boils down to, for us, a focus on the major parts of the eye. So that's what we're going to do for the next 10 minutes or so here, is review the major parts of the eye. Okay, so the next time you go to see your eye doctor, and he or she has that really cool poster on the wall of the major parts of the eye, you're actually going to know a lot of those parts. Or you'll know as many as you remember from what we'll talk about now. So let me label these kind of like I numbered and labeled the parts of the brain or the parts of the neuron in the bio section. Let's begin with the cornea. The cornea is a transparent covering over your eye, which serves partly to focus light on the back of the eye. So it's this clear covering, you can kind of see it right here, over your eye. Okay, you can scratch your cornea. I've not ever done that, thankfully. Apparently that's pretty painful. I'm sure with as many people as we have in here today, somebody at some point has scratched their cornea. Okay. Number 2 on the review of major parts of the eye really goes together with number 3. So we'll do pupil 2 and iris 3. The iris is the colored muscle that surrounds the pupil. Tell me in the chat box, what does the pupil do for our visual system? Yeah, it allows light in, and it, as Nina's saying, it limits and controls the amount of light. So tell me this, if you went outside on a bright, sunny San Diego day, what will your pupil do on a bright day? It will constrict, right? It will get smaller and smaller. If you wake up in the middle of the night in a dark bedroom and you go over to the bathroom mirror and you turn the light on, your pupils will be gigantic, right? Your pupil dilates to let in more light, and it constricts to let in less light, depending on the amount of light in your environment. Okay, so the pupil size is controlled by the muscles that are this colored iris. So if you have brown eyes, you have a brown iris. If you have blue eyes, you have a blue iris. If you have hazel-colored eyes, you have a hazel-colored iris. So it's hard to talk about pupil and iris separately because they're really, they're related, obviously. So those are parts 2 and 3. Part number 4 then is going to be the lens. The lens is an elastic structure. You can see it right here in our cross section of the eye here. It's an elastic structure behind the pupil, which gets thinner to focus on things that are nearby and thicker to focus on things that are farther away. So thinner for things that are nearby, and it becomes thicker to focus on things that are far away. Okay. With age, the lens becomes thicker, and most importantly, it becomes less flexible, causing changes in vision for folks as they get older. The most common of which is with respect to looking at nearby things, looking at things that, like maybe you hand your mom or your dad something to read. As they've gotten older, have you noticed what they do with things that you hand them to read? What do they do with that magazine when you hand it to them? Hey, check out this article. Check out this thing in the newspaper. It's pretty cool. What do they do with that as they try to read it? They squint. Most of them will hold it far in front of them. Like, could you hold this for me over there so I can see it? They just need. If they had longer arms, they'd be in really, really good shape. Okay, so that's what happens with a lens over time. It becomes thicker, it becomes less flexible. You get a fair amount of that going on with folks as they get older. The lens then focuses the visual image, and in this example on the slide, it's the image of a candle. The lens focuses that visual image back here onto the back side of the eye. Okay, it focuses on the structure called the retina. I'm going to label that with number 5, I guess, to be consistent here. And the retina is going to be the star of the show, so I'm going to circle the retina. Why do you think I'm going to say it's the star of the show? What do you think is located here that is one of the central concepts that we're talking about at this point? What's located in the retina? It's got the receptors for vision, and those, as we already mentioned, are called rods and cones. Awesome. Okay, rods and cones are located in the retina. And the retina, you see here, it's sort of a backward-shaped C on this slide, right? It's kind of this beige color lining the back of the eyeball. We have the retina. Okay? It's about as thick as a sheet of paper, lining the back of the eye, and we've got the receptor cells, the rods and cones. Let's talk more about rods and cones now. So rods are concentrated in the periphery of the retina. What does that mean? They're concentrated more along the edges. Rather than being sort of in the downtown area here, they're out in the suburbs of that retina, right? Rods are specialized for black and white vision, and they're most active in dim illumination situations. Okay, rods. Cones, in contrast, are concentrated in the center of the retina, and we've got a place called the fovea that I'll say more about in a minute. Cones are specialized for color vision, and they're most active in bright illumination. Okay, so bright illumination would be a bright, sunny day. Cones are more active. If you're hiking in the mountains at night looking at the stars, your rods are going to be more active in that dim illumination scenario. I've got a little mnemonic device to remember something about cones. What do you think I'm going to do with the C in cones? I'm going to remind you that the cones are located where? The center of the retina, and what are they specialized for? For color, 3 C's there. No extra charge for that mnemonic device. Okay, we've got cones, they're in the center, and they're specialized for color. How are you ever going to forget that? Hey, check out this picture down below. It's an electron microscope shot here. Where are we in the retina as you look at that? The white guys are rods. The green guys, which are shaped like cones, are cones. Where do you think we are within the retina? Jeffrey thinks we're on somewhere along the edges, or along the periphery, and he's right, because we've got tons of rods and not very many cones here. Okay. Questions about the contrasts here between rods and cones? They do complementary things, right? One is black and white, one is color. One is dim illumination, one is bright illumination. One's on the edges, one's in the middle. We've got this fovea structure, so let me label that, I guess, here with number 6. The fovea is the point of central focus, and at the fovea, I want you to note, we have cones and only cones. Okay? There are no rods at the fovea location right here. So given that cones and only cones are located here, tell me what kinds of images it would be best to project onto this fovea location. If you were designing this ideally, colorful, bright, colorful images, color that you're looking at in the middle of the day in the sunshine. That's where you want those images to go. Okay. Again, if you're looking at the stars at night in the dark, I probably want to dump those images more along the edges, the periphery of the retina, not right here in the middle. Okay? Excellent. You guys are on this today. A couple more things to note. We have a blind spot. This is kind of cool. It's also known as the optic disc. Optic disc. And the blind spot is basically a location right here on the back side of our eye that contains no receptor cells at all. So I guess I should say down below here, the blind spot has no rods, no cones. If you don't have rods and you don't have cones at this location right here, then images that are projected on that location are not seen by your visual system. Why not? Why can't you see an image that's projected where there are no rods and no cones? What does it matter if you don't have receptors? Well, if there are no receptors, what doesn't happen? What doesn't happen is that transduction, no conversion to action potentials. Thank you, Andrew. That's great. Jeffrey as well. Okay, so that's exactly the problem. Now, you might be looking at it saying, okay, this blind spot or this optic disc location, why don't we then, as we walk around every day, sort of see holes in our visual system? The reason you don't see holes there is because your brain fills in what's missing, right? So if I'm sitting here and I'm looking, I have a green chair across from my desk here, and if part of that green chair image is projecting to that optic disc, I don't see a hole in that green chair. My brain fills in those missing parts that are being projected onto that location. Our eighth and final structure is known as the optic nerve. I keep this really, really simple. I think about the optic nerve as the power cord that comes out of the back of the eye. So power cord is the way you can think about the optic nerve. It's about as thick as your pinky. We have one coming out of your left eye. We have one coming out of your right eye. And that optic nerve is going to project to other parts of your brain where later processing and further processing of visual information is going to occur. Like, for example, what brain structure do you think the optic nerve is going to project to? We talked about it in our review of major parts of the brain. Everything other than smell goes through what? Yeah, ultimately, we got to get back to that occipital lobe. What midbrain structure right in the middle of your head is this visual information going to get routed through? Thank you, Jamil and Jeffrey. Yeah, through the thalamus, for sure. Okay? In fact, I've got that for you on this slide. If I bounce down a couple, here is the information coming in through left eye and right eye. We've got that optic chiasm that we mentioned. We were talking about split brain patients, so the optic nerves projecting here out of the back of each eyeball. We've got that crossover, the optic chiasm. It goes through the visual area of the thalamus and then ultimately back here, as you guys mentioned, to the occipital lobe, the back of your head, where you've got that primary visual cortex. Okay? That's the story on vision. So let me go back to the slide on the major parts of the eye or this slide on receptor cells. Is there anything in there that is confusing or you want me to clarify for a minute for you? Or do you feel like you've got it? You can tell me in the chat box if you've got it, or if you have a question, just raise your hand, click on that hand button, and let me know that you've got a question. Let's go to Noam and Jamil. You guys can chime in with questions, and Yasmin as well. The cornea is just this transparent covering over the eye. I almost think about it sort of like, it's like cling wrap, right? You might use some cling wrap over the front of your eye here to protect it from, things like dirt and dust and that sort of stuff. We have more cones than rods. That's a good question. I don't know, Tyler, what the actual breakdown is. I suspect that we've got greater concentrations of rods in the periphery, and given that there are 2 periphery areas here, if we count them all up, I would be willing to bet that there are more rods than cones, but I don't know what the answer to that question is off the top of my head. If somebody does know, and you know it from bio, just chime in. But if you made me guess and make a bet, I'd bet on rods. Yeah, so fovea is central point of focus, has cones and only cones. Okay? And the iris serves to help control the size of that pupil, right? So the iris will help that pupil open up, or will make that pupil constrict if it's really, really bright outside. Okay. Yeah, so the fovea is focused for color vision. Yeah, so if you're looking at a bright, colorful painting, because cones and only cones are there, color vision, you would want to see that painting if you're dumping that image onto the fovea in a brightly illuminated situation to really be able to best process that visual input. Okay. And the iris, again, is serving to control the amount of light that goes into the eye. The iris and the pupil, again, together, it's hard to think about them as separate because the pupil is basically the opening in the iris. Okay, so it controls the amount of light that's coming into the eye. All right, good questions. Any others? If I answered your question, you can just click the hand again and let you lower your hand so your virtual arm doesn't get tired. All right, let's let's do this. Let's do a polling question for you guys. Here it is. So let me give you a minute to read through that and think your way through that, and I'll be right back. All righty, I'm going to give you 5 more seconds, guys, here in your dark house. Trying to see your watch in the dark. How are you going to do that? Let's take a look at what you thought. That is pretty darn close to unanimous saying it's about rods. Why rods? Tell me in the chat box. It's dim, right? It's dim illumination. That's the key part there. Awesome. We're moving on. Let's go to the auditory system here. So we'll talk about hearing for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll set the stage for what we're going to talk about with perception on Thursday. This is a nice figure from your textbook. It walks you through steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for hearing. It's fantastic. I'm going to break this down into the major structures like we just did with the parts of the eye to be consistent here. So the pinna is the outer part of your auditory system. It's your ear. When you talk about your ear, I'm going to get my ear pierced, or he bit my ear, or whatever. It's this thing hanging on the side of your head. And what is the purpose of the pinna? Well, the pinna's job is to funnel the sound waves in from our environment. So you're listening to my voice right now, and what your pinna is doing is grabbing these sound waves and sort of compressing them and sending them where they need to go. Okay? If you've ever been somewhere, maybe at a loud concert, for example, and you're having a hard time hearing your friend next to you, what did you do to try to make this funnel work better? The pinna. What might you have done? Well, you could certainly lean in closer. What else could you do to expand the funnel? The cupping your ear, right? You put your hand up to your ear and sort of curl it around it. And when you do that, you're expanding that funnel. Okay? So that's structure number 1. The auditory canal is really the roadway down which the pinna funnels those sound waves. So the auditory canal here on the diagram is just this little roadway down into the next structure, which is the eardrum. What's the fancy term for the eardrum that you guys probably learned in a bio class somewhere along the way? Anybody think of it? Yeah, tympanic membrane, right? So tympanic membrane, also known as the eardrum. It vibrates in response to those sound waves that are being sent its way down this auditory canal. You can puncture your eardrum. Apparently it's extremely painful. I had my middle son have this happen to him when he was a little guy. He was maybe like 1.5 or 2. He was sick and he's stuffy and runny and all that kind of good stuff. And all of a sudden there was like stuff leaking out his ear, and like, that's not right. Let's take him to the doctor. And the doctor's like, yeah, he punctured his eardrum. It reseals itself and everything is good to go, but apparently it's extremely painful, as evidenced by his rather prolific crying and screaming at that time. Hammer, anvil, and stirrup, I'm going to make your life easier by rolling them together as one structure. And we're going to call those, instead of 3 separate little bones, we're going to call them the ossicles. The ossicles are these tiniest bones in your body that vibrate in response to the vibrations being sent to them from the eardrum. So you can see here, if you look closely, the eardrum is going to vibrate. It's going to cause the hammer to push on the anvil, which is going to move the stirrup. 3 ossicles, you don't need to know them individually, because know the ossicles are these little bones. And ultimately what happens is the stirrup here, which, well, it kind of looks like a stirrup, presses on the oval window of the most important structure here in our auditory system, known as the cochlea. Why am I saying the cochlea is the most important structure? Why am I going to circle the cochlea? What do you think goes on in the cochlea? What do we have there that's so important as we talk about sensation? The receptor cells. Do you guys know what the receptor cells are for hearing? We have rods and cones for vision. For hearing, they're called hair cells. And the hair cells line this thing called the basilar membrane, which we'll see up close in a minute, of this structure called the cochlea. So this is the cochlea right here. If you want to remember the cochlea, what you could do is you could say to yourself, it looks like what? What does the cochlea look like? 3 or 4 different things. It looks like a snail. If you're hungry, what might it look like? A cinnamon roll. Okay, what else might it look like? If you really love Star Wars, what does it look like? It looks like a seashell as well. In the very first Star Wars movie, what does it look like? Someone's hair was rolled up like this. Doesn't it look like Princess Leia's hair? No doubt. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so we've got the hair cells in this snail-shaped, shell-like cinnamon bun Princess Leia structure called the cochlea. Okay, ultimately the cochlea then sends information along to other parts of the brain via something called the auditory nerve. I'm going to label that down here, number 6, and I'll circle it for you. It is like the optic nerve was for vision. The auditory nerve I'm going to call what? What is it like now for hearing? I call the optic nerve the what? The power cord, right? The power cord here coming out of your inner ear, and that is going to then go to the thalamus and then distribute that information back out to the temporal lobe auditory cortex on either side of your head. Okay, so the sequence here is pinna funnels it down the auditory canal. It bangs on the eardrum. That moves the ossicles. The stirrup, one of these ossicles presses on the oval window, which is a location on the cochlea. The cochlea is where we've got the hair cells. The hair cells, as we're going to see in a minute here, are going to get manually stimulated. They're going to transduce those vibrations from the sound waves into action potentials. Those action potential messages will be sent out the power cord from the inner ear here, this thing called the auditory nerve. Okay? Let me just show you what goes on here with the hair cells by bouncing down 2 sides. Here is the stirrup, and this is a partially uncoiled cochlea. So we have unrolled the cinnamon bun. Okay, here's the stirrup, and imagine the stirrup is pumping on or pressing on this oval window right here of the cochlea. Well, what do we have? Within the cochlea here, we've got these hair cells. They're kind of hard to see here, but they're these stripy guys. You see them? Within that pink structure there? They're sitting along this thing called the basilar membrane. I actually like this picture over here of the basilar membrane and the hair cells even better. This is an electron microscope picture here. And these guys are the hair cells. And the basilar membrane is sort of this sandy ground, if you will, that they are located in. Okay, it's almost like they're sticking up out of the ground here, these hair cells. What's really cool about hearing is the stirrup here presses on the cochlea, and the cochlea is filled with this jello-like substance in here that's called endolymph. Now I'm going to ask you a really weird question. When the stirrup presses on the cochlea, it's going to press on this endolymph substance. And if endolymph is like jello, what happens when you press on or punch or slap jello? What does the jello do? You didn't think you were going to ask that question today, but I just did. It vibrates. What is the jello, it jiggles, right? I like that, Cameron. It jiggles. When the basilar membrane has the jello underneath it jiggling, what do you think happens to the basilar membrane? When the underground jiggles underneath it, what does the basilar membrane do? It moves, and when it moves, what does that do to these hair cells? It manually stimulates them. And you can try to picture over here, these things start moving around, they start vibrating, they start sort of blowing in the breeze, if you will. Okay? And that's what's causing the hair cells to get stimulated right now as you're listening to my voice through your speakers or your headphones. Okay? The hair cells are being stimulated by the vibrations here within the cochlea. Okay? Let me go back to this. Questions on those 6 major structures that I've laid out for you here in your auditory system. Yasmin, you can use the chat box for the question. You can also, as you're waiting for that question to come in, guys, you can read the 6 steps here, right? The pinna funnels sound waves into the auditory canal, focusing them towards the eardrum. Vibrations in the eardrum cause those ossicles to press on the oval window. Pressure on the oval window causes the fluid in the cochlea, this endolymph, to vibrate. The vibrating fluid in the cochlea bends those hair cells, triggering action potentials. The auditory nerve then carries the information to the auditory cortex in your temporal lobes, where sounds are given meaning. So, questions: what does the pinna and the auditory canal do? The pinna funnels the sound waves in, and the auditory canal carries those sound waves to the middle ear, specifically to the eardrum. Okay? So it's about sending the message along. Gather it up with the pinna, send it down the auditory canal highway, if you will, until we get to the eardrum. The cochlea is what has the hair cells. It has the receptor cells for hearing. It's hugely important because it's where the sound waves get transduced or converted into action potentials. And the tiny bones are called ossicles right here on the slide. It's called endolymph. You don't need to know that, but I'll type it in if you're just dying to know what that's called. I'm not going to answer your question, but the gelatinous-like substance is called endolymph. Okay, good. You're welcome. Did I get all the questions? I think so. Yasmin, did I get your question? Okay, cool. Click on the hand. There you go. You're not going to wear yourself out. I want to give you this little table. It lists the sense, the name of the receptor cells for the sense, and the location of those receptor cells. You could extend this down as you read about the other senses. Here's what we've done so far. Vision. The receptor cells are called rods and cones, and they're located in the retina. You could expand this box, this cell, and say more about rods. Oh, dim illumination, black and white vision, more on the edges, cones. Oh, color vision. They're in the center of the retina, and they're for bright illumination environments. Hearing. We just mentioned we've got hair cells that line that basilar membrane, and they're located where? Oh, they're located in the cochlea. Awesome. Okay? So that's the deal here in terms of trying to pull these things together in a way that makes it so that you don't have 8 or 9 unrelated pieces of information in your brain. We know that memory works better when you cluster things together. So let's cluster rods, cones, and retina. Let's cluster hair cells and cochlea. If we pull these all together here in this little table, we could talk about how they relate to each other, right? How are rods and cones like hair cells? Why is the retina similar in some ways to your cochlea? You've got it all pulled together when you do something like this table. All right? Questions about that at all? We've got about 10 minutes to go, so hang in there. I haven't given you enough polling questions today, so let me give you another one. I'm joking. I haven't given you enough, but let's do one more. Rods and cones are to vision as blank are to audition. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds here, and then we're going to wrap up our discussion of hearing, and I'm going to give you a 5-minute preview of what we're going to do on Thursday as we move from sensation to perception. Wait till you see in AL201 how bright these yellow slides are. It's going to singe your retinas here with these bright yellow slides. Let me grab the results for you. That looks really good. What is that? 72 out of 85 saying hair cells. What's the connection here? How are rods and cones similar to hair cells? They're receptor cells for vision. Hair cells are receptor cells for hearing. Julia gets 1,000,000 bonus points for that explanation. Awesome. We're moving on. Here is a verbal summary of the steps involved in hearing. We could actually expand this, and we could have step 0 and say the pinna sends the sound waves down the auditory canal. I'm assuming we've already got that going. The ossicles magnify the sound from the tympanic membrane. So the eardrum vibrates. Those ossicles are going to get pushed around by those vibrations. Hair cells in the cochlea fire action potentials. This is the key step, right? Without this going on, without this transduction occurring, we don't get action potentials, and we can't do any processing of the sensory input for audition, in this case, at the level of the cortex, because the cortex speaks action potentials. Okay? If you have a speaker pressed up against your temporal lobe auditory cortex directly, and you don't have your auditory system coming in between, you're not going to say you hear anything. You need those things to get moved through the auditory system as we just described it today. I'm adding one thing here in step 3. The inferior colliculus is a brain structure that helps you localize sound in space. What do you think that means? Localize something. Any guesses? I thought about this and thought about you guys as I drove over to campus this morning, because as I was driving, there was the sound of a siren coming. And to localize that sound means to figure out where it's located. Is it in front of me? Is it to my left? Is it to my right? Might it be behind me? Where is it coming from? Okay, and pretty quickly I was able to figure out that siren is in front of me. Okay, and actually then I saw the ambulance coming around the curve, coming towards me, luckily on the other side of the road, right? So if you have ever heard something like a siren when you're driving and you've turned your head to the right and to the left trying to figure out, like, is it on my left, on my right, is it behind me, where is it, right? Obviously you use vision as well, but at the level of hearing and localizing or figuring out where stuff is, we have the structure called the inferior colliculus. You actually have, believe it or not, another structure for localizing things visually called the superior colliculus. So if you're a hawk flying over a canyon and you'd like to find like a rabbit for dinner, okay, your superior colliculus would be activated to help you localize things with your visual system. The thalamus distributes frequency information. So frequency of sound waves, as you'll read about in the textbook, determines their pitch. So higher frequency sound waves are higher pitch, lower frequency sound waves lower pitch. Amplitude of the sound waves actually determines the volume, how loud it is. And then ultimately the auditory cortex helps us to interpret the sound. And this is really a nice segue or transition into the section on perception, because the interpretation, I think, directly relates to this idea that I mentioned earlier of coming up with a mental image, right? So our auditory cortex is where we interpret the sound, and is this mom or my sister whose voice I hear on the phone? Okay, that's happening at the level of the auditory cortex. The sound waves might look very, very similar that are coming into our auditory system, that are banging on the tympanic membrane and moving the ossicles and all that good stuff. It's only at the level of the cortex that we get into this interpretation, right? That we get to the point here now where we're doing some perceptual organization. We end up with some kind of what we're going to call an internal representation, right? If you don't like the mom and sister example, the internal representation might be this mental image that you have of a kitten when you hear the sound coming out of the speakers on your computer, right? And you're picturing a kitten rather than picturing a lion, because you know that that sound is one animal and not the other. Now we're moving beyond at that level the structures in your auditory system, and we're moving towards perception. right? And perception, as it says on this slide here, and this is my preview and setting the stage for Thursday, perception involves the organization and interpretation of sensory stimuli by the brain. And the key word here, I think, is interpretation. This knowledge-based processing, right? So you have had enough experience hearing different sounds to know the sound of your sister's voice versus your mother's voice, the kitten versus a lion, maybe a little dog's bark versus a big dog's bark, right? You sort of have a sense of what that's like based on your experiences, okay? So perception on Thursday, as we move ahead, includes the processing, organization, and interpretation of sensory signals. Again, I really like to focus on interpretation and making sense of what's going on, right? We end up with this internal representation of those environmental stimuli, right? What's the phrase I like to use for internal representation? I like to think about the mental image, okay? So when you hear maybe a certain singer, okay, you might have a mental image of him or her. You've seen them in concert. You've watched their videos on MTV or whatever, right? You have a mental image, even if you don't see a picture of them. When you hear that person singing, based on this knowledge-based processing, you're able to do this higher level work here that is perception. Again, perception, we said earlier on, was later, right, and more psychological. That's exactly what we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about the sound waves banging on your eardrum for that singer. Now we're talking about, well, can you picture him? Can you picture her as you're hearing those sounds, okay? That's where we're going with this. So that's our focus as we move into our discussion on Thursday. We're moving from sensation, which we could sort of check off and say, yeah, we took care of that today, so that's done. And now we're going to move on to a look at perception. Okay. And on Thursday, we're going to do, oh my gosh, it's like 35 or 40 slides. Lots and lots of examples. It's a fun, I actually think it's a fairly entertaining lecture because there's a lot of really interesting and cool things that are part of our discussion of perception. Okay, so that's where we're headed next. Tyler is asking, what are the ossicles? The ossicles are the smallest bones in our body. They include the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. When the eardrum vibrates, it causes these bones to press against each other until ultimately the stirrup presses on the oval window of the cochlea. And again, the cochlea is hugely important because it's got the hair cells that are the receptor cells for the auditory system. Yep. Good. Any other questions on anything from today about sensation and perception? Cool. We've got 2 minutes to spare. So we're going to wrap up for today. Remember, when we're done, make sure you click the X button to exit out. That will permit me to make the recording available to your classmates as soon as possible. We'll pick up on Thursday at 9:30 talking about perception, and I'll see you guys then. All right? Jamila, you can type your questions in the chat box. I'm going to turn my mic off. I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll get out of here and let your classmates check out the recording ASAP. Thanks, everybody.